Welcome to the Energy Balance at a Crossroads, translating science into action, consumer confusion on all sides of the calorie equation. A joint webcast presented today by the International Life Science Institute of North America, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American College of Sports Medicine, and the International Food Information Council Foundation. I'm Marianne Smith Edge with the International Food Information Council Foundation and will be moderating the webinar today. The objectives of the webinar are, as noted, to communicate the latest science on biological and lifestyle changes that impact energy balance that was recently reported in the joint publication on energy balance at a crossroads, to identify and relay the biological, lifestyle, and environmental changes that will most successfully help children and families attain and manage energy balance and tip the scale toward healthier weights, and to translate the science of energy balance into practical and appropriate recommendations for training current and future professionals in nutrition, exercise and physical activity, health education, and pre-K-12 teacher education. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. You have the dial-in information and all lines are force muted. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions, we will allow a time, approximately 10 minutes for questions at the end. So please email your questions at foodandhealth@ific.org. Or join the conversation on Twitter by following @FoodInsight or using the hashtag FoodInsight. The challenge that all of us face as practitioners, communicators, and educators are how to improve the nation's health by improving the number of young people moving into adulthood without the burden of obesity and its associated chronic disease. This challenge was actually the basis for the formation of the Energy Balance Working Group that started in 2010. Initially, representatives from the Academy, ACSM, and USDA came together informally and then formalized more into work group to discuss energy balance among the disciplines and had a collective desire to integrate both sides of the energy balance equation for maximum benefits to the public's health. We want to credit Melinda Menor, PhD, RD, active member of the Academy as well as ACSM, for leading this group and being the leader in envisioning and planning the Energy Balance at a Crossroads scientific meeting and the publications that came from that meeting. Unfortunately, Melinda's schedule did not allow her to participate on the webinar today, but we did want to give her credit for all the hard work she's done over the past 4 years. As noted, in 2000, the expert panel that we just was convened in October of 2012 in Washington, D.C. by ACSM and the USDA Agriculture Research Service. And the desired outcome that we will talk about today is really how do we translate the science of energy balance into practical and appropriate recommendations for training current and future professionals in nutrition, exercise and physical activity, health education, and the pre-K-12 teacher education. As I noted, that one of the first outcomes of the work group is the joint publications that have been recently published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, entitled Energy Balance at a Crossroads, Translating the Science into Action. If you haven't read the article, I hope you will, but you will definitely get an overview from the webcast today. Our speakers today are John Jacasik, who's professor and chair of the Department of Health and Physical Activity and the director of Physical Activity and Weight Management Research Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Katie Brown, registered dietitian and National Education Director of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Foundation, and Marianne Smith Edge, Senior Vice President of Nutrition and Food Safety at the International Food Information Council Foundation. So with those introductions, I will now turn it over to John to talk about examining biological and lifestyle factors influencing the dynamic nature of energy balance. John?
Great. Thank you all for joining today. Hopefully I have control of these slides, so we'll see how that goes. So my task today is to talk a little bit about the dynamic nature of energy balance and the lifestyle factors that play into that. The first thing is that I am part of the American College of Sports Medicine, and we are the largest sports medicine and exercise science organization in the world with over 50,000 members, the certification programs and the like. And so we like to think to make sure that physical activity and exercise are part of the discussion around energy balance, as well as the importance that is placed on energy intake and nutrition. So when we think about energy balance, it suggests that we have basically a static process. And because of that static process, many times these things kind of sit in silos, as I like to say. However, when we think about things fitting in silos, if we were to do something with energy expenditure, either increases or decreases, many of the approaches that occur actually then suggest that nothing will happen to energy intake. So we make somebody be more active, or somebody becomes less active, and we assume that nothing happens to energy intake when those modifications are made. Likewise, when we change energy intake, the assumption is that nothing happens to energy intake. And so that's what's considered to be a static process of energy balance. That's one, but not the other. However, I think that the research is becoming more and more clear, and I believe this, that that's actually the wrong approach. That when we sit in silos and affect one side or the other side, and expect it not to affect the other side, that's probably not the right approach for us to be thinking about to have the most impact on energy balance. In fact, I think that if in fact we're changing energy expenditure up or down, that there's a high likelihood that we're actually changing energy intake up or down, or in some cases possibly leaving it the same, even though that was never the intention. So we get somebody exercising, it's possible that their energy intake is changing in response to that exercise. Likewise, when we change energy intake up or down, it's very likely that in many cases the energy expenditure is affected in some way as well, going up or down, and in some cases it may stay the same. So I think if we think about the fact that whatever we do on one side of the energy balance equation, even though it may be inadvertent, can change something on the other side of the energy balance equation, I think we now start to think about this process not as a static process, but more as a dynamic process in nature. And I think we have to be sensitive to this so that when we're trying to affect one side, we understand the other side can be affected. So let's talk a little bit about how that potentially can happen. So let's think just a little bit about energy expenditure. And the one most variable component of energy expenditure, as shown on this slide, obviously is physical activity. Resting energy expenditure and thermic effect of food is pretty stable in most individuals unless you're really dramatically swinging something in their lifestyle that's going forward physiologically is going to make that change. But physical activity is the most variable component for us to be thinking about. And when we think about physical activity, we really need to be thinking about physical activity as two different types of components. One is those structured periods of activity that we like to call exercise. You go to the gym, you go for a walk outside, or you go for a bike ride or something like that. But many individuals have a lot of other forms of physical activity that we need to start to take into account that happen within the context of their lifestyle. And many times those actually have a lot of variability in them as well. And so we have to be thinking about not just exercise when it comes to energy expenditure, but total energy expenditure that may come from physical activities that can include periods of exercise. So, let me make this go. Okay. So, So let's think just a little bit about this. So if we take this one step further, the first question that comes up is, well, if I was going to affect energy intake, would this have any influence on energy expenditure? If I just focus on energy intake. And I actually think that that's a very high likelihood that that could happen. So you can see this on this figure here, that there's a lot of possibilities of what could happen if you either change energy intake or energy expenditure. And I won't go through those in any kind of great detail, but it's very clear that if I change energy intake up, a lot of things could happen to energy expenditure. So we're going to focus just on a couple of slides on this concept to kind of make this point. So the one place that we obviously can start to affect energy expenditure is in the thermic effect of food. And those of you on the webinar who have a lot more experience in terms of food and nutrition and diet than I do can probably greatly appreciate the fact that certain types of foods prepared certain ways can actually have a higher thermic effect or a lower thermic effect than other foods. And so if we think about, how do we change energy expenditure, or how does food intake change energy expenditure, even though it's a very modest effect, there is an effect here. That if you change the type of food that a person's eating or the preparation of that food, that changes the thermic effect of that food, it could cause something to go up, down, or possibly stay the same. So the bigger issue, though, for us is, and those are modest changes, the bigger issue for us is, well, what happens, though, if we start to change calorie intake on a much larger basis? What happens when we start to modify calorie intake up or down in terms of energy intake? What will happen to the energy expenditure of an individual? Well, we can look at some cross-sectional data, and one thing that we know about people is that the larger they are, the greater the resting energy expenditure is. And so these are just calculated data from some estimates. And you can see here that a person, the larger they are in terms of their body weight, the higher the resting energy expenditure is. So if we were to alter body weight through changing energy intake, it's very likely that we're going to be changing energy expenditure as well. And so what is then, how is that happening, and what's the possibility of that happening? So we've done a couple of different studies, and I'm just going to present one here quickly to you, where we've actually had individuals change their energy intake and reduce their calorie intake to the levels that you see here. And this is about a 500 to 1,000 calorie reduction in the energy intake that they were actually at. And we also had them incorporate physical activity for a period of time. And these are the data for a period of basically 1 month. And in our control condition, they basically had no intervention happen at all. Just maintain what you're doing for a period of 1 month. And these are overweight individuals. And what you see here on this slide is actually what happens within a period of 1 month to energy expenditure at rest. That even a modest weight loss in this case, it was about a 5-pound weight loss, over the period of 1 month, actually showed a significant reduction in energy and expenditure at rest. Suggesting that, when we start to manipulate these things, even independent of a significant weight loss, you already start to see compensation in energy expenditure. And you see that whether or not you look at it in an absolute way, whether you correct for that for body weight, or you correct for that with lean mass. So there is an influence here that we need to be taking into account. So the other thing that can happen, obviously, is if we change energy expenditure, what can happen to energy intake? And actually, there's a lot of work being done in this area right now that is really kind of a hot topic right now for us. And so there's a lot of ways to change energy expenditure. So again, the most variable component of energy expenditure is physical activity, and that's what I'm showing here, is that it can have a lot of impact on a number of other factors relative to energy expenditure and energy intake. So let's take just a quick look at the data that suggests that maybe there's an influence here. So the one thing that we need to think about, if we're thinking about, in this case, how energy expenditure affects body weight, and I show those in green here, everybody thinks that the first pathway that happens is that energy expenditure affects body weight through energy intake. So we purposely, that it's possible that something's happening there. So if in fact, just for example, I get a person exercising, they start burning more calories, I expect something to happen to their body weight. However, if in fact I start to assume that there's going to be some influence over here on this energy intake side, Well, that's another component that's going to factor into how that affects body weight. And in some cases, the increase in energy expenditure may actually be coupled with an increase in energy intake that may blunt the effect that it has on body weight. In other cases, energy expenditure may actually be coupled with a decrease in energy intake through hunger and satiety, and that may also influence body weight as well. So it is possible that this can occur. So one example of this, looks like I skipped over a little quick. So one example of this is that these are data from the Midwest exercise study. These are women, and these are women who responded and didn't respond to a 16-month intervention of physical activity and exercise, supervised exercise in the laboratory. And these were young adults in their 20s. And what you can see here is in response to this 16-month intervention, that about half of the women lost weight with that intervention, and half of the women gained weight with that intervention. They focused just on exercise and physical activity. There was no recommendation to change energy intake at all. So if you were to quantify just the energy expenditure, you would estimate that they should have all lost weight. But half of them didn't lose weight. Half of them actually gained weight. And even in those who lost weight, there's a significant amount of variability here. So it's possible that this physical activity has differential effects on metabolic parameters, hunger and satiety, that influence intake and that will influence body weight. So one of the things that we've done is to look at that, and these are data here that I'm showing you from an acute exercise session. So what we've done is brought people into the laboratory, and we've actually exercised them for about 45 minutes at a moderate to vigorous intensity on one day, and on a completely separate day, we brought them in and just had them sit around for that period of time. So there was no exercise on the second day. And in both cases, we exposed them to free ad-lib food in a kind of a buffet setting after those sessions. And we just monitor how much food they actually consumed after those sessions. And what's interesting is that on this side of the equation, these individuals consume more following exercise compared to rest. So in this particular case, even with exercise, this would reflect that the person was gaining weight with exercise because they were eating more on an exercise day than on a rest day. These individuals ate less on the exercise day compared to the rest day. So in these people, exercise would potentially, theoretically, cause weight loss. And this is interesting because, again, these people eat more following exercise. These people on the left eat less following exercise compared to rest. And that's an interesting look of the spread of the data. And I want to just go back and show you that when you look at the data from the Midwest exercise trial, which was 16 months, not just one episode, the curves of those lines in terms of weight change look very, very similar. These are the data from our bout of one bout of activity in the lab. This is 16 months of 4 to 5 days supervised exercise. So it may be that what we're hitting on here is that for some people, energy intake is actually going up with certain doses of exercise, and we need to be sensitive to that. So the other thing is this one component of energy expenditure influence other components of energy expenditure. Do these things right here influence one another in some way? And the one way that we can start to take a look at that is relative to resting energy expenditure. Well, what we know about resting energy expenditure, and these are just data from our lab, but others have shown this, is that resting energy expenditure is a very stable measure unless you're doing something to manipulate it. So day-to-day variability in resting energy expenditure is actually quite small, and we've shown that a couple of different times. However, does activity influence this resting energy expenditure? And I think this is something that a lot of people talk about, and the question is how much of an effect is there, if there even is an effect? So one of the ways that we think about this is something that an old term, but I like to use it because it really applies, and that is something known as the EPOC, or the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. The amount of energy that you actually consume following exercise once the exercise has been completed, that would be above the resting level. And what we find is that when the oxygen consumption actually requires about 6 to 15% more oxygen post-exercise than if you were just to sit around at rest, which is correlated then to energy expenditure. These are just the curves. Looks like it might be, I don't know if it's cutting off on your screen. It's cutting off a little bit on mine. But these are basically the curves of the extra oxygen consumption that one would have following a bout of exercise that was about 70 to 80 minutes in length, moderate to vigorous intensity. And you can see that very quickly after the exercise, the oxygen consumption starts to come back down to closer to near baseline levels. What's interesting to see here is that the higher the oxygen consumption after the exercise, the more calories one would burn. So a lot of people talk about like the afterburn of exercise and how that influences energy expenditure. Well, if you take a look at this, these are in milliliters per minute of oxygen. If you were to look at this, if one was to stay only 50 milliliters, which would be about right here, for a long period of time, over 12 hours, above resting expenditure after an exercise bout, that would result in an extra 180 calories per day. If they actually were only about 25 milliliters of oxygen above resting state in response to exercise over a period of 12 hours, that would add to an extra 90 calories per day. So in many ways, there is this extra caloric expenditure. However, one would have to take into account and think about it in a relative sense. This is a big number, but is it as big as some people think? And we all can appreciate that 180 calories is half of a Snickers bar. 90 calories is probably a third or so of a Snickers bar. So you could wipe this out relatively quick. So the reason exercise works for long-term weight loss is probably not solely due to the afterburn that you get from exercise. So the other thing that we know is that as one exercises, something can happen to the resting metabolic rate, and a lot of people talk about it going up over time. So in reality, what actually happens is at times the resting energy expenditure actually is going to go down a little bit because we become much more efficient with exercise training. The person's getting in better shape. They can be more efficient with their energy utilization. And so we don't really see these big increases in energy expenditure under resting conditions that a lot of people think is actually happening. In some cases, we actually see a decrease in that energy expenditure. So these are data from a 12-month exercise training study, 17 subjects who exercised. And what you see here is really quickly, if you look down in this bottom left-hand panel, this is resting energy expenditure. In response to 12 months of exercise training, there's virtually no change in resting energy expenditure, even if you look at it by relative to body weight or relative to fat-free mass. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about the fact that exercise will solely by itself change resting energy expenditure in most people in the population. So just to kind of start to wrap things up, the other thing is when we get somebody exercising, it's possible that there's compensation throughout the rest of the day. So what can happen is, this is a theoretical rationale, is if you take someone pre-exercise, they haven't done anything, you exercise them, this little blip right up here is technically the added exercise or the added energy expenditure coming from exercise. If in fact that actually results in some extra added activity or energy burn, you're going to get potentially a really big increase. So over the course of the day, you might have a significant change in total energy expenditure. And that is theoretically what happens. However, if you start to take a look at some individuals, and there's some data out there, we have some of it on our own, when you look at people who start exercising, sometimes they compensate at other times of the day and start to reduce other forms of activity. So I exercise today, I can watch television a little bit more. I exercise today, I can sit around a little bit more. So the total change in energy expenditure is very, very small, if anything at all. So even if you've exercised 500 calories a day, your total change in energy expenditure may be far less than that because you may be compensating by sitting around more throughout other periods of the day because you're now exercising. So we do have to be careful about the dynamic process of this, even though those things are not intended. So I want to kind of bring this to a close and just kind of state that I really think that the best way for us to be thinking about energy balance is that energy balance is a dynamic process. That when we think about changing energy intake, there's pretty good evidence that it's going to change energy expenditure in some way. If we change energy expenditure, it's going to change energy intake potentially in some way. And I think we have to be very, very sensitive to that. And I know that Katie and others are going to talk about this in just a little bit, in that how important it is for us to be taking kind of this two-pronged approach to energy balance, and understand that professionals in the area of nutrition, dietetics, and food science really need to be working closely with people in the area of energy expenditure, physical activity, and exercise collaboratively for us to really understand this and to implement programming that is actually going to impact energy balance, potentially body weight, and potentially risk factors that go with that. So with that, I would like to bring my section of this to a close, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, John, for the great presentation. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and forward them an email to foodandhealth@ific.org or join the Twitter conversation. We'll now move to Katie Brown, who will talk about energy balance education, preparing the next generation of educators in nutrition and dietetics and exercise science. Katie?
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks, John. That was a great kickoff to the webinar today. So I'm going to give a little background about the educational background and training for both registered dietitian, nutritionists, and exercise science professionals, and some of the recommendations that came from the Energy Balance at a Crossroads, translating the science into action manuscripts that were published recently in 2 journals. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is the world's largest organization of nutrition and food professionals. The Academy is committed to improving the public's health and advancing the profession of dietetics through research, education, and advocacy. And our foundation is the world's largest charitable organization devoted to nutrition and dietetics. And you see our vision and mission here, optimizing health through food nutrition and empowering members to be the food and nutrition leaders. This slide shows a wide array of practice areas for registered dietitian nutritionists, or RDNs. You can see everything from clinical nutrition, inpatient and outpatient, to food nutrition management, community consulting, and education research, and others. Many of our members hold advanced degrees, so nearly 50% have a master's degree and 4% a doctorate degree. And this slide shows that we have a broad reach and influence. 93% of physicians referring patients to RDNs, 71% of consumers viewing RDNs as a very credible healthcare provider. Over 20 million clients and patients are counseled individually each year by RDNs. And through our Academy Media Spokesperson program, over 30 billion media impressions are garnered each year. So when we look at the qualifications of a registered dietitian nutritionist, to become an RDN, one must complete a coordinated program in dietetics or a dietetic program in dietetics, what we call a DPD program, followed by a dietetic internship program that's accredited by the Accreditation Council for Education in Nutrition and Dietetics, or ASCEND. Then one must pass a national board exam to become credentialed as an RDN. And then one must complete continuing professional education requirements to maintain registration. So a few key points about dietetics education for RDNs. ASCEND, our accreditation body, establishes the education standards to ensure proficiency for an entry-level position in the workforce. And the standards for dietetic education programs are reviewed every 5 years. Now, currently, the 2012 knowledge requirements and competencies do not specifically address knowledge or skills in exercise science or in physical activity. So some key points about fitness professional education. Exercise science includes the disciplines of biomechanics, sports psychology, exercise physiology. Exercise science students are trained to become practitioners who assess health and fitness, develop exercise prescriptions, lead exercise sessions, and support clients in the behavioral aspects of maintaining a healthy lifestyle. They're typically either self-employed or employed in university, corporate, commercial, or community settings. And the Commission on Accreditation of Allied Health Education Professionals is the accreditation body for college or university-based education for exercise science disciplines. So the energy balance at a Crossroads paper identifies that within this field there's been a shift in research priorities and public health recommendations from exercise for fitness to physical activity and exercise for health and prevention of chronic disease. ACSM has 3 certifications that require an earned degree, either a bachelor's or master's degree, with approved coursework requirements and a supervised practice program. So the certified health fitness specialist, certified exercise specialist, and the registered clinical exercise physiologist. ACSM also has some other best practice certifications that don't require a degree. These are certifications accredited by the National Commission for Certifying Agencies. So as we heard from Dr. Dietetics' presentation, what's known about the dynamic nature of energy balance really necessitates the inclusion of considering both energy intake and energy expenditure influences to effectively achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. So the energy balance at a Crossroads paper identifies 4 recommendations for the training of future professionals who influence the health and wellness of children in order to prevent childhood obesity and associated chronic diseases. Recommendation number 1 is to create a multidisciplinary approach to the training of exercise science and physical activity professionals and registered dietitian nutritionists in the dynamic nature of energy balance. This would mean including physical activity standards and competencies into the training of RDNs, and likewise integrating nutrition knowledge and skills into the training of exercise science and physical activity professionals. Integrating behavioral science education strategies into the educational programs of both majors was also identified as being beneficial. Recommendation number 2 is to develop competencies for pre-K-12 school teachers and physical education teachers using the dynamic energy balance approach. This would be beneficial in many ways, including empowering teachers with the knowledge and skills to help students make healthy choices, and could be done by integrating nutrition education into the curriculum, incorporating daily physical activity and short activity breaks into the school day, and being a healthy role model for their students. This training would also provide the foundational knowledge to be advocates for integrating nutrition, physical activity, and behavioral education focused on promoting healthy body weight for students. Recommendation number 3 is to develop standards in both nutrition and physical activity for K-12 schools that integrate dynamic energy balance. Cross-curriculum promotion of energy balance in nutrition education and PE, health classes, and others provides opportunities for reinforcement of healthy eating and physical activity behaviors. School policy should also reflect a culture of wellness and support healthy eating and opportunities for daily physical activity. And while the national nutrition education standards do not exist for K-12 education, the Institute of Medicine is considering developing a framework for such guidance for elementary and secondary education, and integrating dynamic energy balance into any proposed framework for nutrition education would be very beneficial. The energy balance at a Crossroads paper also includes a table that identifies the successful school-based energy balance programs. I'm highlighting a few here. The Energy Balance for Kids with Play program, a program developed by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Foundation. Energy Balance 101, developed by the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation and Discovery Education. And the Fuel Up to Play 60 program, developed by the National Dairy Council. The 4th recommendation is to encourage the development of dynamic energy balance education and experiential learning opportunities for current health professionals. Opportunities such as the USDA Higher Education Challenge Grant Program, the U.S. Department of Education grants, university programs, or professional organizations that produce educational materials used in training future health professionals could be some examples. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the Academy or the American College of Sports Medicine are currently in discussions about developing a joint certificate that would incorporate dynamic energy balance. So those discussions are underway. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mary Ann to address consumer perception of energy balance and strategies that can be used to relay energy balance messaging.
Thank you, Katie. I think Katie has set up that the opportunity is definitely the time of nutrition and exercise science professionals need to effectively communicate the importance of both sides of the energy equation, energy balance equation. And so if you have any additional questions, please email to foodandhealth@ific.org. So my part will be to really understand the consumer knowledge of energy balance and to answer the question, are we connecting? The IFIC Foundation mission is to effectively communicate science-based information on health, nutrition, and food safety for the public good. And we are primarily supported by the broad-based food, beverage, and agricultural industry, as well as grants from government agencies. We know in the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory, or the Dietary Guidelines Key Recommendations, one of the key recommendations is about balanced calories with physical activity to manage weight. But I think a question we need to ask is, do consumers really understand the recommendation? In 2010, the Dietary Guidelines Alliance, which is a 15-member group including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the IFIC Foundation, embarked on a three-phase consumer research project to really help understand what triggers messages and would influence families to motivate them to lead a healthier lifestyle in 2011 and beyond. Essentially, to really get an understanding of their thoughts around calories and physical activity. And the key takeaways you'll see here is that we found that if achieving energy balance is the goal, getting parents to believe that calories are important is a crucial step that cannot be skipped. And they really need to understand what calories are. We found this to be a true and somewhat surprising takeaway, that individuals don't have a good insight on what calories truly are. But also to know that calories are not good or bad, but they need to pay attention to them and as they can positively impact weight. And it has to become easier for them to pay attention to calories. Still, calories need to be presented within the context of food and beverage choices. And we also saw that parents understand the benefits of physical activity. In fact, most agreed that they've been active at some point in their lives and have experienced the benefits firsthand. But the problem is staying committed, and they've all said, kids come first. So in the qualitative as well as in the quantitative, we really tested messages, those top performing messages that not only resonated with parents, but resonated to the point that they said it would motivate them to make changes. These are the top 6 messages that we've tested. I think you can see that there's some similarities in all of them. 1, they're action-oriented. They're simple. They provide a how-to, and most of all, they empower the consumer to make changes. So if you look at these tested messages, the key is know your number. Learn how many calories you should consume in a day. Calories count. Calories are like a budget. You can only eat so many in a day. And fun stuff counts as exercise. And that was probably one of the best tested messages because consumers saw that we can get active with the family regardless of what you do, just do something. And small steps, take charge of your weight. The empowerment to balance the calories you eat and drink with the calories you burn. And small steps equal big changes. As serve smaller portions to help curb calories and keep your weight on the right track. And base your plate on nutrient-rich foods that offer beneficial nutrients and fewer calories. we saw that that resonated with consumers as long as we had the descriptor of choosing fruits and vegetables, whole and enriched grains, lean meats, and so forth. In addition to the earlier research, we always ask about calories and physical activity and calorie balance in our annual Food and Health Survey that's conducted by the International Food Information Council Foundation. And it's an online survey that's representative of the U.S. population of 18 to 80. This year, in the 2014 survey, consistent with previous years, we see that 9 out of 10 Americans basically describe themselves as being from good to excellent health. And this is actually in line with CDC results as well. We also saw this year is that half of all Americans have given a lot of thought to the healthfulness of their foods and beverages they consume. And we can see that those who give the most thought are college grads, women, and those with lower BMIs. We also find that consumers are saying that they're trying to make an effort to eat more fruits and vegetables when we ask consumers which of the following efforts that they're taking that are in line with the recommendations with the dietary guidelines for Americans. I think one that you need to see, though, when we actually ask the question, are you balancing calories to maintain my weight, slightly less than 6 out of 10 say that they are doing it, or at least understand that balance message. When we ask consumers which of the following best describes what they're doing about their weight, we see that about 80% are trying to lose weight or maintain their current weight, where 1 in 5 say they're really not doing anything about their weight, and that has increased a little bit over the previous year. Of the majority of Americans report trying to lose or maintain weight, when asked what methods they will use for weight management, as you can see, 4 out of 5 say that they would eat smaller portions, and 3/4 say they would track and increase their physical activity. So even though they may not be saying they're balancing their calorie intake with physical activity, you can see that they can relate to very practical methods that really are around calorie balance. In general, we see that consumers think that tracking and increasing physical activity and eating smaller portions actually are the most effective weight management strategies for the average person. I think it goes back that small changes can equal, or small steps can equal big changes. When we ask consumers how often they think about the number of calories they consume, we see that slightly more than 40% think about calories often or always. We see 30% sometimes, and about 25% think about calories rarely or never. Over the past year, when we asked them how much thought have they given to the amount of physical activity you get, we see that more than half of Americans say that they've given a lot of thought to the amount of physical activity they get, and compared to 2013, we though see twice as many say they have not thought about physical activity at all, but that's still a very small number. So when we ask consumers in the past 2 years, have you increased the amount of physical activity, you see that about half say that they have. And among those who did increase the activity, the most important reasons why include seeing a change in the way clothes fit, a change in weight, or a change in health. But despite the fact that over 50% of consumers say they are trying to get more physical activity, we do see from our research that roughly 1 in 4 Americans really meet the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services physical activity guidelines. So we may be doing more, but we still haven't achieved the number of minutes that are recommended. We also see that when the majority of Americans say they do not know how to correctly estimate daily calorie needs. And we see when we ask that question is that over 60% responded, but it was definitely incorrect. So again, they might understand energy balance, but really understanding how many calories consumed, even more so burned, is still confusing. And this next slide shows this, because we see that 30% of consumers say they're really unsure about how many calories they consume, but over 50% say they really are confused and unaware of how many calories they burn. I think it goes back to John's note about sometimes the calories only equal a very small portion of a candy bar, and so maybe we don't understand or we really don't want to realize the true facts. In a question we get asked a few years earlier, we asked, is that, are you really making an effort to balance calories consumed and burned? And we see here that 70% say they do not make an effort to balance calories in and calories out. So again, they might be making some steps to improve physical activity and eat smaller portions, but then when you really ask the question around balance, there is some disconnect. What's interesting, though, is that when we ask consumers, what do you think is harder to do? Is to eat more healthfully, consistently, or consistently be active for at least 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week? And you see that Americans are really evenly split in whether they believe it's more difficult to eat well or exercise. What's interesting, if you note, is that men say they're far more likely to be challenged by consistently eating healthfully than remaining active, and the opposite is true for women. So I think with this conversation that we've had today, you can see is that energy balance really is at a crossroads. And so our call to action is to make energy balance messages that are relevant, realistic, and specifically to our specific populations and communities. We have to realize is that one message doesn't fit all, and we have to really tailor those messages for specific populations. In fact, the outcome of the energy balance at the Crossroads workshop were some 4 key recommendations around communications. The first is to communicate energy balance messages that are tested and relevant to the intended audience. Develop consistent messages across the spectrum of audiences, and create partnerships for delivery of message and practice of energy balance. And most of all, map integrated nutrition and physical activity programs currently being provided. I think it's important to say, don't reinvent the wheel, but look at where we can partner and ensure that we're consistent in our messages around energy balance, calories in, calories out, if consumers truly are going to understand and be able to implement and make changes. So our call to action today is that as nutrition and exercise science professionals, we need to effectively communicate the importance of both sides of the energy balance equation and its dynamic nature, and to emphasize both energy intake and expenditure and their effect that one has on the other. So I think in the words of Albert Einstein, you would say, information is really not knowledge without understanding. And so we do have an opportunity to accept the challenge of moving individuals to a more healthful lifestyle. So at this point, if you have questions, we have a few. Please email them at foodandhealth@ific.org. And following the webcast, we will give you the information on how to access your CPE certificates. So at this point, and this one is for John, and this was from Christina Stella, is that the question was, what does it mean to be sensitive to, on exercise days, weight gain may be linked to increased caloric intake? And the second part of that is, how do we prevent increased caloric intake on exercise days?
So two-parter. So I think the first piece of this is that just the example would be, a person comes into the clinic and they said, I've been exercising all week and I can't believe that the scale's not moving. And it won't move that fast. but you have a person who's a chronic exercise and the scale's not moving. And the first thing is that people say, well, that's got to be an increase in lean mass, when that's really not the case. Rather than saying, okay, so let's take a look at whether you even realize if there's anything changing on the energy intake side. So let's take a look at your pattern of intake on the days that you're exercising compared to the intake on the days that you're not exercising, and see if in fact that there's some compensation going there. And so I think that when I say being sensitive, it's to the fact that there may be some people who don't consciously eat more on the exercise days, but are kind of grazing more throughout the day, and it causes a higher energy intake. So, we have to be actually going in and asking the right questions to kind of get a sense of whether or not that's actually happening or not. And so that ties to kind of the second answer in terms of how do we deal with that. Well, part of that is helping people to be consciously aware of what of their eating behaviors. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to tell them always, to cut calories and so on, but for them to be paying attention to their eating behaviors. And, we like to use the word self-monitoring. But in some ways, keeping tabs of, on an exercise day, I tend to eat, 2 bagels. On a non-exercise day, I tend to eat 1. So being conscious of that, and also if they're conscious of that, they can then make smart decisions about how to make it so that doesn't occur necessarily. And I don't want to overstep my bounds in terms of, kind of my scope of practice as an exercise person. But I also think that many of the nutritionists and dietitians on the call could probably give really good advice for how a person could spread their calories out throughout the day and eat smarter foods or different foods that would help the person to feel a little bit more satiated following their exercise or on exercise days that wouldn't necessarily lead to a higher energy intake. So there are ways around that, but it's us being conscious of the fact that it can happen in order to create solutions to that problem.
Thank you, John. Another question, how do we know that increased calorie intake is responsible for compensation rather than the greater fluid retention or more weight that may come from developing muscle tissue?
So a couple of things, and others may want to chime in on that. I don't want to give you the impression that all of this is related to compensation from energy intake, but I want to highlight that it can be a contributor. Clearly, there could be fluid retention issues or fluid flux issues that are contributing. But I do want to caution everyone on the call about the fact that when a person's exercising, that there's this massive increase in muscle mass. That really doesn't happen. It happens at a very slow rate. It's a very small amount that it increases. And, you really have to engage in high levels of exercise, probably high levels of resistance exercise, to actually get these really large increases in lean mass that are going to counterbalance in a significant way the weight loss that one might observe with exercise. So I think that there's compensation going on an intake side. There could be, as the question posed, that it could be something with fluid balance. And again, this comes down to us asking the right questions and monitoring the right things for us to make those decisions about what's happening. But I can tell you that if a person exercises for 2 weeks and they come in and say, well, I'm gaining weight and it's got to be all muscle at this point, that's very highly unlikely that that's the case. So I think we have to be realistic as well.
Thank you, John. Katie, this is one for you. A question: at what age should children be taught about calories? I know that's always a point of discussion around practitioners, and possibly at what grade level should energy balance really be explained?
Oh, great. So we've been implementing and evaluating an energy balance curriculum for the past 7 years in different school districts across the country. And we've worked with kids in kindergarten through 9th grade. So, there's a lot of things you can do around promoting energy balance without really engaging in a discussion around calories. So, for younger students, talking about opportunities for healthy eating and making healthy eating fun and building skills in preparing healthy snacks and healthy foods and things like that, being advocates for healthy eating in the home, and making healthy choices at school are ways that we can talk about healthy eating, and then encouraging the enjoyment of physical activity. Oftentimes, with adults, we think of physical activity sometimes as a punishment. So, I'm going to enjoy this delicious dessert, but then I'm going to have to, instead of making physical activity something that we look forward to and really enjoy. And so if we could start kids off on that healthy footing where kids are enjoying eating healthy foods and enjoy participating in physical activity. Some of the other things that we encourage teachers to do in this regard is related to school parties. So, there's some policies now that discourage cakes and cupcakes and snacks and treats like that on birthdays for kids. But a fun way to set to a healthier situation is to provide those opportunities as extra recess or playtime with the PE teacher or the principal or things like that. So use physical activity as a celebration or a celebratory opportunity instead of kind of a negative, are some ways that we can encourage children to adapt that positive energy balance messaging and practices both on healthy eating and physical activity without being super prescriptive. These are how many calories you need to eat in a day. These are the number of calories you need to burn in a day, and things like that.
Thanks, Katie. A couple more questions. We still have time. One of the questions are, is there any validity to the concept of a set point regarding weight that the body tries to maintain? John or...
Well, I'll take a stab. Katie may want to jump in. But I think there's a lot of controversy about this. This concept of set point goes way back. I think that what happens is that the body hits a certain level of equilibrium, and you need to knock it off balance in order for the body to go up or down in weight, and then actually make it sustainable. So, and it takes time for those adaptations to occur. And unfortunately, many weight management programs are so short in nature, and when I say short, I'm even talking as little as 12 weeks or so, that there's just not enough time for that to actually change the metabolism and change the physiology and the biology in a way that it actually makes it a little bit more conducive. So, there are a number of biomarkers, for example, that may drive fat storage, for example, and not fat utilization. And over time, you need to, as you're losing weight, shift that biology so the body is more efficient at burning fat, for example, and less wanting to actually store that fat. And so I think that the set point, there are biological drives that we need to be thinking about here, but I don't believe that many of those biological drives will prevent people from moving their body weight, but they may make it just more difficult for them to move their body weight. And if we don't attack them correctly, it may just make it more difficult to sustain that body weight change long term. So I don't think there's a true quote-unquote set point, but I do think there are challenges that work against us biologically that make it more difficult.
Yeah, and I think when we're working with individuals on weight loss and successful weight management practices, some of that behavior modification language around set point, I think that is something that our clients can really understand, with that analogy to a thermostat in your home. And it does take some adjustment, and some of that long-term adjustment could be related to just establishing those healthy habits and making those part of your everyday routine, and that takes a bit of time to happen. And so, encouraging both the biology sometimes to catch up, but also those everyday behavioral choices that we make in healthy eating and physical activity take a bit of time as well to become standardized and normal and routine.
But we have a time for one more question, so I think this is a good one to end. So I think John and Katie both may want to address it. The question came in: how do we estimate calorie needs if 3,500 calories per pound doesn't work anymore?
That's a good question. There are these data out there suggesting that the number's not 3,500 anymore. So and I think that there's some pretty good evidence that may be correct. Part of this, and we can be as technical about this as we want, or we can be a little bit more less technical about it. And the one thing that I think is advantageous right now for many of us in the field, and they're becoming cheaper and cheaper, are these monitors that actually a person could wear, even in their free living world, to allow us to actually get a sense of, at least a ballpark number of the caloric needs of that person as they go over the course of the day or the week. And those are really, while they're not perfect, they actually will give us a really good estimate of energy expenditure if you pick the right monitor. So, and they're not that expensive. And so I actually feel like we can be a little bit more precise about energy needs. And for many, many years, it was all about measure resting energy expenditure and then estimate all the other stuff. Well, now I think we have the technologies that can allow us to actually get a better sense of what the energy expenditures are, and then we can match energy intake to those energy expenditures over the course of time. So I think that there are these techniques to actually make that happen.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Katie, as well, for wonderful insight that you have provided today, and thanks to all of you who participated on the webcast today. As noted here, following the webcast, for more information on the energy balance at the Crossroads Experts Panel, you can reference the article at the Journal Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, as well as the Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise that was published just recently in July. Also, a reminder that participants of this live event webcast who are registered dietitians, are dietetic technicians registered, are eligible for one continuing education unit from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and participants who are ACSM certified professionals are eligible for one ACSM continuing education credit for participation in the live webcast. An email will be sent 1 hour, please give us 1 hour, after the completion of this webcast with a link to download the certificate. Please be reminded that the CPEU is only available for those pre-registered for the live webcast today. However, the slides and the recording of this webcast will be available on the sponsors' respective websites. You can always, it will be posted on foodinsight.org as well as ILSI North America, the Academy, and ACSM websites. So once again, thank you all very much for participating today. Have a great day and a great Labor Day. Thank you.